Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I want to talk about metadata consistency in family history projects. Why? Because it's one of the more difficult topics to deal with, and if you're not consistent, you are going to be doing things over and over again, and we want to try to avoid mistakes as much as we can so that you can work efficiently on your projects. So if you're new here, my name is Caroline. I am a certified photo organizer, an organizing and productivity coach, and I help people get their ducks in a row. And one of my specialties is the family history industry. And so I do help a lot of people with photo organizing, family history, genealogy type organizing when they're trying to get all of their archives neatly lined up. So I just thought I would talk about this topic because it's one of the more popular topics that I teach, and it's one that's not easy to wrap your head around. So I want to go over a couple of tips. I want to give you some rules to live by and just explain sort of the more basic concepts for you so that you have an idea of what you're getting into. So you've probably heard the term metadata already, right? What does that mean? Well, it's an intimidating word. If you Google it, for sure you'll know. You'll have millions and millions of results. And it's not easy sometimes to get a straight answer in terms of what you need to care about, what you need to think about in your projects. And so I wanted to clear up some of those frequently sort of misunderstood pieces and narrow it down so that you have more of a container of what to think about. And the first thing, obviously, we need to talk about is what is metadata and why do you even need it? Metadata is all the information that is stored in your digital files. So I like to describe it as the who's, what's, when, where's, and even sometimes how's of your photos, right? So it's what puts your files into context. In organizing, context is everything. If your data, basically your files, have no accompanying information, people won't know what it's for. People don't know what to do with it. And more or less, your computer doesn't know what to do with it, right? So we need metadata in order for our files to be communicated in a meaningful way to other people and to operating systems. And so it's really important that you get this right, but it can be very, very overwhelming if you first come across it because it's a high learning curve, right? Trust me, it took me years to figure this out. So I'm taking all of my knowledge and distilling it down for you, so hopefully you won't have the same learning curve that I did. But basically what you need to know also is that there are different types of metadata, right? There's administrative metadata, structural metadata, preservation metadata, descriptive metadata, and so on. You don't necessarily need to know everything about all the different types of metadata that's out there, okay? We tend to focus on descriptive metadata in photo organizing because those are the stories, right? That's the information that we need to mostly communicate. And so that's really where I want you to focus your attention and not really worry about all the other noise, okay? And when we talk about metadata, we should also know that there are different formats of metadata. And one is Exif, and that's information that gets basically put into your files at the time of creation. So if you take a photo, for example, it's the timestamp. For example, on that picture that was put in by your camera or phone or whatever you took the photo with. If you're scanning a photo, it could be the scanner that timestamps it. It could also be things like ISO settings on the camera, things like that. And you can think about that as the technical metadata. So it's all the stuff that surrounds the creation of the file. So it's really important to know that stuff. For example, if you're trying to recreate a photo, right? Let's say there's a beautiful photo by a famous artist that you want to recreate. Well, if you know what settings that person used, if you know, all the details surrounding the creation of that image, then you could replicate it. So it's basically how we talk about the file at inception, right? And that is really important in terms of dating photos correctly. And that's usually where the biggest headache is to get the Exif timestamp correct. Sometimes that's off because, let's say, date and time on your device was wrong, right? Things like that happen. If you scan a photo, for example, then the timestamp that goes into the photo is not when the photo itself was taken, it's when you scanned it, right? So things like that happen all the time where we have to go in and correct that timestamp. And that's a big thing in photo organizing especially. Other than that, we don't have a whole lot of Exif things that we need to deal with. So just knowing that it's there and that it's the timestamp usually that you have to fix is really helpful. But then there's the IPTC metadata, right? Which is the International Press Telecommunications Council. And that is where the majority of the stuff that we want to put into the file lives. So things like keywords, captions, identifying the people who are in it. If it's a photo, that's where all that story information lives. And that stuff is important because it's really not possible for a device to know why something happened, right? Where it happened could be in there, and when it happened could be in there, but who's in the photo, for example, or why was it taken? Well, that's not something that a device is going to know. That's information that you have and that you have to put into the photo, for example. And so that becomes a bigger part that we deal with. And so just focusing on that part especially is helpful. Then we also sometimes have to deal with XMP metadata. And that is a format from Adobe, right? So we use that a lot with Adobe products. And usually it gets baked into the file if the file type can handle it, but sometimes that isn't possible, and so we get a sidecar file. And so that's really a bigger headache too that we deal with sometimes. But that's also important to know if you come across what that is. It's a type of metadata. One of the biggest problems that people have when they put metadata into a file is that they don't use a program or software or solution that does it correctly, right? And so what we need to do is use a program where all of the standards basically line up so that you get metadata that embeds into your files directly and not just into the program. Because otherwise what happens is if you move the files out of that program, the metadata stays in the program and the files go basically their separate ways. We don't want that. We want the metadata to go into the files directly, best case scenario, right? And travel with the files no matter where the files go. And a lot of people get in trouble because they don't know how that works. And so they pick a program or a system or a solution or something that doesn't adhere to some of the standards, and then they put in hours and hours of work, and that work then eventually goes away. So we want to make specific, dedicated, intentional choices around the solutions that we pick, around the programs, around cloud hubs, around all of the tools that we use, so that we have metadata basically that sticks with the files. So the Adobe product suite comes to mind as a good example of that. For example, Lightroom, Bridge, and those types of programs, right, that work on any computer that you put it on. And so that's kind of an underrated way to just be intentional and understanding that something as big as your family history archive might take a while to work on, and who knows where it's going to be in a year or two. And so if that's the case, then you want to make sure you have a long-term strategy for staying consistent. So being able to stop, start, and pick up kind of where you left off without feeling like you're starting from scratch is actually a really big deal. We want to make sure that we can keep momentum as much as possible in these projects. So again, tip number one for staying consistent in the long run is making sure that you intentionally pick a really good software program that adheres to metadata standards and does what it's supposed to without trouble, and works cross-platform, right? So really, really easy, underrated, but beautiful strategy to deal with. Tip number two is to always test your storage hub. In fact, I want to say testing it multiple times, because technology changes so quickly that it is impossible to stay updated on all of the latest changes in all programs that are available. And so obviously, I'm working full-time as an organizing and productivity coach. I do stay updated on a lot of it, but if you are stopping and starting again, pausing every now and then, things may have changed since you last looked at it. And so anytime we stop and start again, we want to make sure that our storage hub still works the way we intended it to. There may have been rule changes, there may have been software updates, there may have been other changes that the company has made that you are not aware of. And we always want to make sure that whatever we're using, tools, cloud storage services, hubs, anything at all that you use, that it still works the way we intended it to when we selected it. And so always, if you are new to a hub, for example, upload a file, test how it handles metadata, download a file, see if the metadata is still there, does it strip your metadata? Can you embed metadata and download it? Can you upload it and still have it show? There are all of those questions that we want to make sure that we get answered before we marry it. Being able to transfer files from one hub to another without losing information, that greatly improves your workflow, and it just makes things so much easier. So we always want to make sure that we test before we decide and make decisions. Tip number 3 is to batch process using presets. And that's something that a good photo organizing program will let you do. Obviously, batch processing is a great way to get a lot of things done, and we want to make sure that we do that in family history projects because we're dealing with so many files. So we don't want to work on files one by one. No, that will take way too long, right? We want to make sure that we batch process everything that we can and that we work efficiently. And in most quality programs, batch processing is made easier by using presets. So a metadata preset is basically a template for you to input all the metadata information that you want to save to a bunch of photos, but you create the template once and then you apply it to different groups of photos over and over again, and that allows you to work faster and also smarter. And that is something that you can only do if you have a really good quality program that allows you to do that. Batch processing is always something we want to try to do because it's a really great way to save time and energy, right? We don't need to type the same thing over and over again to one photo and then the next photo and then the next photo. No, we create templates and we apply those templates to multiple photos at once, okay? And so if you have a really good quality program that lets you batch process and that lets you create presets, then you will save yourself a ton of time and effort. And of course, you will be able to be more consistent. So always check if that program that you're interested in has the ability to let you create templates. Tip number 4 is to use controlled keyword vocabularies, okay? That's a mouthful. What does that mean? Well, it means that you have basically a little list of keywords that you want to use, and it's controlled, meaning that you have selected those terms up front and with intention, okay? And so what normally happens is that people start applying keywords randomly as they work on their archives, regardless of what files it is. And sometimes this happens in our businesses too, right? Where we just add a keyword and then another keyword and then another keyword, and then it kind of spins out of control. It snowballs until there are so many keywords that we don't know which ones to search for. And sometimes there are duplicate keywords or keywords that essentially mean the same thing, but they're actually for different things. And the way we think about this in digital asset management is that we create those keyword lists up front when we are setting up the archive to begin with. So this is really something that is more of a prep step than it is an as-you-go type step. And so when you use controlled keyword vocabularies, you have specifically selected the words that you're using. So a great example of this would be my name, right? So my full name is Eva Susanne Caroline, and my nickname is Kina or Caro, right? And then my last name has switched, right? It's Nilsson, maiden name, or Guntur, married name. And so what name do I go by in my own photo archive? Do I go by Caroline Nilsson, Caroline Guntur, Eva Susanne Caroline Nilsson, Eva Susanne Caroline Guntur, right? Those are the types of questions that you have to answer up front and then stay consistent with. And it takes a little bit of prep work, yes, but when you do this, then you will have no problem understanding what to tag, how to tag, and then what to search for when those tags are implemented. And this is one of those things that I constantly have to go in and fix for people because they didn't think about this up front. And so I just want to put that out there that when you use controlled keyword vocabularies, You have specifically, intentionally selected a number of keywords that you use, and you have reasoning behind why you chose them. Okay? And then you don't stray from that vocabulary. You stick with it and you implement it as you decided. And that's actually one of the biggest bonuses that I give people when they join my course DPO Pro, which is my photo organizing masterclass. Is the VIP students that join, they actually get a 12,000 keyword vocabulary as a bonus, because it saves so much time and energy to just be able to click and implement that from the beginning, right? Instead of them having to come up with their own. And so, of course, you don't have to have that type of big keyword archive, but let me tell you, they tend to balloon pretty quickly. And again, they snowball. So if you are not 100% specific and intentional with the selections that you use, you are going to end up with a mess. And I want to make sure that we prevent that as much as possible. Along with that also goes controlled formatting, right? Which is a nuance of the keyword vocabulary. So for example, I'm European, right? So I might say at 1600 hours, whereas in the US, we will say 4 p.m. Which is it? And those are the little things that you have to know how they are going to be put into your archive. And you have to be consistent, because if you then search for 4 p.m., you're not going to get the results if 1600 is the keyword that's in there, right? So we want to make sure that all those little nuances have been thought through and that you can then apply them consistently using these presets, these templates. And numbers is one thing. There's other examples as well that I could go into depth on, but think of it in terms of numbers. I think that's the easiest thing to wrap your head around, right? So if you're saying Caroline's first birthday, are you spelling first F-I-R-S-T, or are you spelling it 1-ST? That's a typical example of things that can come up. And so we want to make sure that we deal with numbers, codes, dates, anything like that in a very consistent way in order to keep that control over our vocabulary. Finally, if you want to take things up yet another notch, we can try what's called a taxonomy. And what that means is that we have our controlled keyword vocabulary with all the controlled formatting and all the nuances in place, but we have so many of the keywords that we need to organize them, right? Sometimes you can have keywords lists that are only, 10 or 12 or 15 phrases long. Maybe you have a set of 50 or even 100. Whatever that number is, if it's under 100, you can probably get by with just the running list. But what if you have 10,000 keywords? Then we need a way to organize those keywords in relationship to each other so that all names are in one place, all dates are in one place, our locations are in one place, and so on. Otherwise, it's just going to be too hard to find the keyword that you're working with, right? And so in order for us to stay consistent, it's really nice to have that taxonomy so that we can work even faster and even smarter. And what's really cool about taxonomy, and especially when you use it, obviously, with a program that's cross-platform and has the metadata standards and is tested and has been around for a while, is that it lets you work, again, with the templates that are so useful. And what we can do is import a complete taxonomy into a good program, and then we can apply strings of keywords to our photos in one shot. So, for example, let's say that I take a picture of my house here in Chicago, right? Maybe I want to use the word Chicago as a keyword. Maybe I want to use the word Illinois as a keyword. Maybe I want to put in that it's USA in the keyword, right? And if that's the case, I would have to remember to put in all three of those keywords. Whereas with a taxonomy, the keywords list can already be organized to be US, and then underneath that, Illinois, and then sub underneath that, Chicago. And by choosing the root of Chicago, it actually filters down and applies all of the other keywords as well. And that's really beautiful because then I don't have to remember to put in all three individually, right? So we can really work smart with templates when we use a string of keywords, and that's what a taxonomy lets you do. So again, it can be a little bit of work to put this in up front, but when you do, the project gets so much easier and it stays so much more consistent. And so I hope that's helpful for you to hear. Again, just to recap, we want to make sure we use a cross-platform program that adheres to metadata standards so we don't have any issues between, computers and devices and things like that, and putting the information actually into our files. Then we also want to make sure that we test whatever storage hubs and solutions that we use to make sure that nothing has changed since we last looked at it. Then, of course, we also want to batch process everything as much as possible using those presets, aka templates, so that we can get as much done as fast as possible without having to retype things again and again. And in those templates, we should have access to a controlled keyword vocabulary, which is a set of intentionally selected keywords that you've specifically chosen for your project and that you're clear on how they should appear. Along with then the controlled formatting, right? And of course, if there's more than 100 keywords, that should look like a taxonomy so that we can put in entire strings at once. So those are some of the tips that you can kind of apply right now in order to be consistent. I promise you it'll be a little bit of work up front, but everything else will be so much smoother and you won't have to start over again and again because you learned something new or you forgot something or you wanted to do something else and you forgot, right? So consistency is always the key to organizing anything. And by implementing some of these sort of standard processes and doing things in the right way to begin with, you eliminate a ton of extra work. So I hope that was helpful to hear. If you are interested in diving deep with us into metadata for genealogy, specifically how to name people, is it maiden or married name, right? Or locations. Do you put in what it was called back then or what it's called now, right? How do we deal with changes throughout time, historical changes? And how do we deal with language differences? For example, my photo archive is in Swedish because I'm Swedish, but my daughter is the one who's going to be using it. Should I put it in English as well, right? Things like that is what we're going to talk about. It's going to be lots of fun. And again, it's a 2-part workshop series on October 8th and October 15th of this year, 2022. So I'll make sure to put that link below so that you can check that out and see what it's all about. It's going to be super fun. If you are in DPO Pro, which is my photo organizing masterclass, don't forget to register for this because that is free to you if you are a VIP student. Everybody else has to pay a nominal fee to get in, but it should be well worth it considering how many hours of work it's going to save you in your family history project. So I hope to see you there. That's all for this video. I'll talk to you soon.